You'll be promoted so fast, Ken. You might be dean.
There you go. I don't know.
Yeah.
Does anybody really want to be a dean?
You know, the scary thing about university administrators, to paraphrase PJ O'Rourke, is they're really not in it for the money.
The New Brunswick Archaeology Podcast, featuring your hosts, Gabe Reineck and Ken Holyoke.
Welcome back to the Brunswick Archaeology Podcast. I'm Gabe Reineck in sunny Fredericton, New Brunswick, and I'm joined, as I am just about every fortnight, by Ken Holyoke in his home studio in Lethbridge, Alberta. How are you, Ken?
I am very well, Gabe, and it is a bright and sunny day here in Lethbridge after a very warm weekend. We had some high 20s temperatures. It was lovely. Yeah.
Excellent. High 20s temperatures, high 200-kilometer winds. Is that the...
No, actually,
No?
we're getting towards the end of the windiest season, so that as you settle into kind of the summer pattern, there's lower wind speeds, actually.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
The so isn't there a thing where you can like use a kite as a sail while you're on a small like skateboard or big skateboard?
Probably. I know you can do that when you're on the water.
Oh, maybe that's what I was thinking of.
Yeah.
Windsurfing.
Yeah.
That's what it is, I guess.
Yeah, you'd have to have water here, though. I guess you could go find a slough in the next couple months before they all disappear when
There
they
you
dry
go.
out. But yeah.
And
it was Derby Day for you guys just on the weekend, eh?
it was. That's right. We had the Derby Day party there, the annual Derby Day party, which the real perk of not going to CAAs. I mean, there's a couple of perks to not going to CAAs, but one of them is that you get to host the Derby party, so that was fun.
Yeah, and the listener won't know this, but on a Derby Day a few years back, my wife and I, who I don't know if we were married at the time, but we went and visited a then graduate student, Gabe Reineck, his abode in Maine while he was doing some of his PhD research, and it was the house of some famous writer or something, wasn't
Not
it?
exactly. It was a home that was owned by Deepak Chopra's attorney,
Right. Okay, that's
but
what
I
it
was
yeah.
I was renting. Yes.
Yes, and as we, it took us quite a while to find the place because Gabe gave us instructions that involved that it was just past the Hannafords. And if those of you who are familiar with the highway system in Maine, every exit has a Hannafords on it, and so if you turn off of any exit in sort of mid Maine down to the South Shore. Down east Maine, you're going to pass a Hannafords at some point, so it's nearly impossible to find a house in there. And then when we finally got a hold of him, he said,
Also,
"Oh,
just to
well,
interrupt, I love that Ken is teasing my directions, whereas he just invented a place in Maine by combining a string of locations. You know, down east, South Shore, mid coast.
but he tightened up the navigation by giving us some flagging tape out on the road. I'm colorblind, and Gabe
Yes.
helpfully tied about a 3-inch piece of orange flagging tape an arm's length into a bush that I miraculously passed by. But long story short, we arrive at the abode finally, and we come in, and Gabe has a wild look in his eyes, and he's got a cauldron, probably I'd say about a 50-gallon cauldron on the stovetop, and it smells just delightful in there. And you were mixing up a batch of mint julep, basically.
That's
right.
That's the mint simple syrup that you need to use for it, or that it helps if you use for it. But Ken, I have an interesting thing to report to you. That actually wasn't a Derby Day. That was just a Tuesday night.
Well, there you go. So whether it's Derby Day or it's field work, folks, if you're looking for the mint julep recipe, maybe it'll be in the show notes today.
And actually, I have a recipe suggestion for our Canadian audience. So as you know, Ken, become fairly difficult because just when you needed it most, it's become impossible to get bourbon in this country. Canadians who are looking to do their patriotic duty, though, and this was figured out by friend of the show, Dave Black, who many of you know, who's been doing the Lord's work and trying to figure out which Canadian whiskeys are drinkable.
Right.
And he's actually found a reasonable substitute, which is that the Signal Hill whiskey makes a serviceable bourbon substitute in mixed drinks.
Oh, excellent. So And I haven't gotten it yet, but there's a liquor store here in town called Andrew Hilton, and it's kind of they're the pros basically. And I was having a conversation with them because they now have on the shelf a couple of the distilleries out here that are doing bourbon substitutes, and they said that they tested several of them, that they ranked from basically will make you blind to undrinkable, but they've found two that they said are probably closer to a rye palate, but that are pretty serviceable bourbon replacement, and are made by Canadian distilleries. So,
oh, interesting. Okay, yeah, and I'm actually trying to remember here, and well, we'll just have to share it onto the show. Dave has also figured out one that's a serviceable Scotch solution from somewhere in Vancouver. I can't remember what it's called right off the top of my head, but it's drinkable. But anyway, the Signal Hill, it doesn't really substitute as a sipping whiskey, but I think it worked pretty well in juleps and that sort of thing. But enough about whiskey, and let's get on to something really fun, which is that we're sponsored right now by the University of New Brunswick still.
Yep.
And we thank them for their support, which is clearly just going to hold the line here until that fifth try on the Shirk will undoubtedly be successful.
Exactly.
And you'll know that because we'll be wearing gold jackets.
Exactly. Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, Ken, one of the things, though, that might help to improve our future Shirk applications, we've realized there may be some ambiguity when we're submitting our Shirk applications about just how broad and far-reaching our podcast is. Do you think it's possible that's the problem?
It could be one of any number of problems that we have tried to interpret from the data that we receive.
Yes. They are minimal. They are minimal, our data. But so as we've been trying to parse that, one of the things that's occurred to us is just, since we're also in growth mode, we might want a name that helps this podcast to grow, wouldn't you say?
Yes. We talk a lot about our SEO.
Yes.
And that may be, the New Brunswick Archaeology podcast may be a bit esoteric for search engine optimization.
Exactly. I think that's totally possible. And so one thing we also know is that we have some of the even when our listenership will grow, we've already attracted really some of the best listeners in podcastdom, wouldn't you say?
I would say, and probably the best looking as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, certainly
Yes.
Intelligent, all those things. And so, but in addition to that, I mean, probably the reason this hasn't been renamed is when you're that attractive and that hardworking, you often don't have time to do these little extra things like write into a podcast and say,
Exactly.
This should be your new name. So listener, if that's you, you're not going to want to miss this next prize. But before they know that, Ken, where would they send a new name for this podcast?
So they would send that to newbrunswickarchaeology@gmail.com. That's New Brunswick Archaeology, all one word, archaeology spelled ARCHAEOLOGY, newbrunswickarchaeology@gmail.com. They could also send it direct message or comment on any of our posts on our Instagram page, which is @new_Brunswick_archaeology, and archaeology spelled the same way.
We will also accept it packed in with a case of smuggled Wild Turkey 101. That's a fine thing. You can write it on the side of the case.
Or attached to whatever your favorite Canadian bourbon replacement or favorite Canadian rye is. I will accept whiskey in any form with a podcast title as well.
Okay, that's fair enough. Some of them, we'll send a more detailed list about which ones to send to Ken. I may be a little pickier, but that's all right. But Ken, what would the lucky listener get if they rename this podcast?
Well, so Gabe, spring has arrived, right?
Yes.
The vernal equinox. Yeah. It was at this point in the Babylonian calendar that the year actually began, with the first new moon after the March equinox, and also the day after the return of the Sumerian goddess Iana, later known as Ishtar by the Akkadians. Queen of heaven and goddess of love, war, and fertility, would emerge from the underworld.
Were those the Acadians in Nova Scotia or the ones in Louisiana?
These are the AKK-Adians. So Iana would emerge from the underworld in the Akatu ceremony with parades through the Ishtar Gate to the Iana Temple and the ritual and reenactment of her marriage to Tammuz, or to the Sumerians, Dumuzi, or Dumuzid, the god of shepherds and fertility. It's also around this time of year that you'll hear the robin's song returning. Lots of talk here of crocuses emerging, and in my own yard, my recent realization that I forgot to plant garlic cloves last fall, but happily forgot to harvest at least 3 of them, as they are sprouting in the garden right now.
Oh, very nice.
Are there any signs of spring on your end, Gabe?
Yeah, there's a few. I mean, the Derby, as you mentioned.
Yeah.
And also that the St. John River has done that thing where it gets high enough to make you really worried about the destruction of downtown Fredericton.
There you go. And so that's excellent, and the spring freshet is a natural process, a process of renewal, and actually something that kind of ties in with what we've got here tonight. And so this fortnight on the New Brunswick Archaeology podcast, we're actually celebrating spring, but we're going to keep things grounded. And no, I'm not talking about Dumuzid being dragged back into the underworld for failing to properly mourn Ayana. I'm talking about stirring up that ground and thinking about what bounties it can provide to our listeners in the coming year. We've made it our mission to ensure a healthy lifestyle, and part of that is fiscal and food security.
Would you say that your new policy is till, baby, till?
We'll find out here. And in these challenging economic and recent patriotic fervor, and that's with a U here in Canada, we figured it was as good a time as any to think about a tariff-free way of life for our listeners this summer by offering, to the lucky listener who renames the New Brunswick Archaeology podcast, a prize package that you can't cucur beat. No, you might even say it's a helianthus of a prize, one that Iva stepped up to the Chenopodium to announce today. That's right. From the late archaic to your backyard, our prize package is going to be simply amazing. Now, you may grasp, what exactly is in this prize package for me? Well, we're going to start with the soil and work our way back up. That's right, we're swapping out the auger for a bucket and taking the NB ArcPod skid steer right down to your local nursery of choice to load up a couple of yards of premium soil made up of an exclusive mixture of soil, lime, and compost. Now, this is hot work, it's hard work, and we wouldn't want you to go hungry or thirsty. So we'll be feasting on PEI mussels cooked Provençal style and chasing it down with a completely tariff-free New Brunswick-made Moosehead lager. Now, because we're thrifty and we waste not, want not, to improve the quality of the character of this soil, we'll pitch those shells right into the matrix and crush them up with a custom-engraved New Brunswick ArcPod round shovel that you'll get to take home at the end of this. Now that we've got your soil beefed up and nutritious, it's time to harken back to the late archaic and bring back the oldies but the goodies. The OG horticultural suite from the eastern half of the continent. That's right, we're going to get your garden going with the EAC itself, the Eastern Agricultural Complex of Plants. And we'll be sowing rows of sunflower, North American squash, marsh elder, and goosefoot. Now, you might not be familiar with the latter ones, but these plants pump out close to 1,000 kilograms of food per hectare and all produce edible, often oily seeds or quinoa-like starchy seeds. They're all high in protein, fats,
There's
iron,
nothing like
and calcium.
quinoa-like to make something like quinoa seem even more appetizing.
Well, and they're also, speaking of the spring freshet, they're particularly well suited to disturbed environments. So even if you forget to fertilize, as long as there's an annual flood and you're stirring up that ground, you're going to get a bounty of delights. And of course, we wouldn't leave you holding the hoe and not give you recipes to gobble those varietals down. So here's a preview. We're going to start with an appetizer of goosefoot spread and soup adapted from the Wild Vegetarian Cookbook. We'll follow this up with a marsh elderberry jam, courtesy of the Greg app website, and you'll be enjoying this spread across your toast, made with sprouted goosefoot flour, compliments of the Wild Food Girl, and Ken's own sunflower butter recipe. Now, the
some of our listeners are excited to hear the phrase goosefoot instead of goose step right now, I think.
Exactly. Now, the main course is going to be a stuffed squash recipe, compliments of Oklahoma Cherokee chef and caterer Nico Albert, and Burning Cedar Indigenous Foods. It's stuffed with celery, wild onions, sumac, and topped with dandelion petals and edible flowers. After this delicious dinner, we're just going to leave you to your own devices to plant, maintain, or just casually garden your way into a low-level food producer. Before long, you'll be experimenting with maygrass, knotweed, little barley, and who knows, maybe a friend from the Southwest will send you a little maize and beans in the near future. Get the helianthus off your anus and come up with a new name for the New Brunswick Archaeology podcast.
Oh, wow. The listener's going to be hurtling towards complexity in no time at all at this rate. So, Ken, where would the lucky listener send that package for complex flavors and social complexity?
They would be sending that to newbrunswickarchaeology@gmail.com. That's New Brunswick Archaeology, all one word, archaeology spelled ARCHAEOLOGY, newbrunswickarchaeology@gmail.com.
That's right. Rolls off the tongue like a cucurbit. And
Exactly.
So, Ken, if you reach into that mailbag, what's in that mailbag for us?
Well, so we are going to have to hope that this prize package attracts a couple new names, but we do not have anything other than, so we've got some scheduled maintenance by Apple Podcasts on May 10th. So
okay. So if the podcast is closed on May 10th, listener, you know what's going on.
Exactly.
But even though we don't have anything in that mailbag, we have a special treat today, and that is that we're going to be joined by Trevor Charlemagne Dow. He's a professional archaeologist with Ecofor, and he's an instructor here at UNB. His research focused on archaeology and heritage policy, legislation, and permitting, the rise of the cultural resource management industry, and knowledge production practices in the dissemination of archaeological research. Within CRM, he's conducted hundreds of archaeological assessments throughout North America. Among other works, he's the lead author of the Bibliography of New Brunswick Archaeology, available wherever fine books are sold. And today he's joining us to discuss a forthcoming, or I guess in some sense past-coming paper, authored by the three of us in the Canadian Journal of Archaeology entitled Backdirt and Bureaucracy Revisited, an analysis of research trends in New Brunswick's archaeology practice using historic data. And that should be out sort of bizarrely with the date of 2023. It's going to be in the 2023 issue of the Canadian Journal of Archaeology, which is not yet out, but we hope will be out soon. And so welcome to the show,
Maybe
Trevor.
by the time this airs.
Maybe by the time this airs.
Maybe by the time this airs, yes.
Yeah. But
welcome back to the show, Trevor.
Yeah, thank you. Number 5, 6 appearance? I can't remember.
It's not even a jacket anymore. It's like maybe a special badge. Maybe
get the roving correspondent.
Yeah, there you go.
Yeah. So, Trevor, I thought maybe we could just start with asking a very evocative title. And I should say this paper's by all three of us, so this is going to be a strange. I'm interviewing us is how this is going to work here. But since Ken and Trevor really live CRM, and I'm just a dilettante, I'm going to let them do most of the talking. And let's face it, Ken would do most of the talking anyway. So where does the title Backdirt and Bureaucracy originate?
This is inspired from, I think, I guess the paper that sort of inspired our research in our paper, and that's was a paper authored by Chris Turnbull, who was New Brunswick's first provincial archaeologist, and it was a paper he authored back in 1977 called "Of Backdirt and Bureaucracy," and it was sort of an investigation into government practices in archaeological investigation, essentially. And because that's kind of what this paper is about, sort of looking at, research trends in New Brunswick's archaeological field research and those kinds of things, and sort of how government policy and those sort of instruments that regulatory agencies use has sort of impacted.
Right. He's got a quote here from that paper that we used to start off the article. Archaeology has entered in a small way the political arena. And so could you guys kind of comment a little bit on that? Just what's he talking about there? What was that big change he was describing?
So it was particularly prescient because Turnbull was kind of drawing attention to the fact that at the time that he had joined the New Brunswick government, he recognized that the CRM industry should be regulated, but that embedding archaeologists into government bureaucracies would mean that they would be reviewing and approving or, regulating an industry that was probably tied into what were even then politically and politically charged projects, basically, right? And so that archaeology was going to now be a little bit in the crosshairs of a process that involved environmental regulation and probably, interest from the public as well as developers and potentially politically sensitive or politically touted projects that, archaeology was now at the intersection of all these things as well as Indigenous interests in that process,
So this is sort of the problem, I guess, that you can have, difficult decisions are the ones in which there's either multiple good choices or multiple bad choices, not when there's one obvious choice. So, maybe everyone's cool on development, but there are trade-offs, and archaeologists were going to be mediating some of that, basically.
Yeah, and I think too it was the concern about whether or not archaeologists embedded within the government would like many bureaucrats have the ability to have an independent opinion about their particular subject and be able to engage with a political sphere that was receptive to that. I think the traditional function of the public service is to be sort of these educated experts in a particular topic to inform government policy and practice. And I think even in the late 70s, you saw that the bureaucracy was becoming increasingly politicized in a way that was steering it away from this traditional view of like independent, objective opinions that then a politician would distill to looking to funnel ideas into a particular area and focusing research in that way. And so I think Turnbull recognized this going on around him more broadly in the bureaucracy and said that now that archaeology is participating in this bureaucratic structure, that this is this political arena that they've stepped into.
Yeah, and I think the other thing too that Turnbull talks about is that one of the problems is that, as you say, they're not just, archaeologists and researchers anymore, but they're employees of this bureaucratic system that ultimately all of these decisions that are being made are in some way being made at a political level or by a political entity or a political branch of the government, right? And one of the, I think, Turnbull's quibbles, or one of the things that he was highlighting at the time, these people that, we refer to in the paper as archaeobureaucrats, which is a great term, I think, coined by Josh Dent. But that they were being granted responsibilities and powers within their own jurisdictions without with this absence of oversight or of discipline-wide oversight or what Turnbull called it an effective outlet for the spirit of brotherly watchfulness or something along those lines, right? And I think that's the other issue is that can these individuals that are as Ken said embedded in political departments and political spheres, can they be independent? Will they have true independence from political decisions without sort of a third party providing oversight to make sure that these things are actually happening, right?
Yeah. So to give us a little kind of context for this, between Turnbull talking about the kind of inception of heritage legislation and where we are now in the province, it might be helpful if we do kind of a little bit of a history of archaeology legislation in New Brunswick and maybe what sort of local or national or even international trends that those pieces of legislation are follow. So if maybe one of you guys could chime in with that and just give us kind of an outline of evolution of the legislation.
Yeah, I mean, broadly, I guess, speaking, New Brunswick didn't have any archaeological legislation until 1954 when the Historic Sites Protection Act came into legislation. That sort of established, I guess, a baseline for, what kind of work needs to be done in advance of, developments and things like that, or what to do in the identification, in the case of identifying archaeological materials and those kinds of things. That act was revised a few times, 1973, and so around the time of Turnbull's era, because he started with the province in 1970, I believe. And so that was revised a few times over the years. And then the next big piece of legislation that came in that really impacted that was the Environmental Assessment Act regulation, which came in under the Clean Environment Act. And that was in 1987. Yeah, 1987. And that was, sort of what spawned the modern culture resource management or CRM industry, commercial archaeology in New Brunswick, because that was the piece of legislation that tied, archaeological investigation to the environmental impact assessment process, which was, tucked under the Clean Environment Act. So, all of a sudden, if there's a development project going on that is triggering the Clean Environment Act regulations, then archaeology has to be done for that. So whether it's a highway or a bridge development or, a justice building or something like that, if there's being involved, if it's, meeting all of these triggers under the Clean Environment Act, then, archaeological assessments have to be done. And that's kind of what really spawned modern commercial archaeology in New Brunswick, like I said. And then we didn't really see much in legislative development or policy development until 2004 when the province issued its first guide for heritage resource impact assessments in New Brunswick, and that was authored by Albert Ferguson, who was the manager of the Archaeological Services Unit at that time. And that sort of laid out a basic field methods for how you should be doing archaeological surveys, in particular, for this kind of work that's going on for developments and things like that. So it established a minimum distance between your shovel test pits in the field, of 5 meters and things like that, and it stipulated how far back from areas of watercourse shorelines to shovel test for looking for buried materials and things like that. And it really sort of outlined how to report on your findings and sort of what the bare minimum of a report should include in those kinds of things. And then a few years later, we see sort of a series of legislation and guidance documents and policy documents sort of come out all between 2009 and 2012 And that included new guidelines in 2009. There were two versions of those. There was a set of guidelines specifically for conducting heritage resource impact assessments or sort of commercial CRM style archaeological projects. And then there was a companion document or a sister document, whatever you want to call it, that was called the Standards for Conducting Heritage Resource, archaeological investigations in New Brunswick. And that was more geared towards academic, or what we define in this paper as problem-oriented archaeology. Those projects that are academic in nature or hypothesis-driven or what have you. The year after that, in 2010, we get sort of an updated version of provincial legislation in the form of the Heritage Conservation Act, and this geared to replace that Historic Sites Preservation Act that first came in 1954. But also to sort of update and improve on that. It improved, things like fine structures. I think the maximum fine under the old Historic Sites Preservation Act was paltry. It was like maybe a couple of $1,000s, and now it's hundreds of thousands of dollars, things like that. It made specific sort of references to other pieces of legislation, and it just really updated the process all in all. And then a couple of years after that,
it includes like specific definitions for archaeological objects, paleontological objects, and built heritage. So like historic buildings and things like that. And so those kinds of definitions of the resource didn't exist under the Historic Sites Protection Act. And so, you have this shift away from interpreting what might be a resource to having legislation that explicitly states what those resources are. And so, kind of outlines what constitutes an archaeological object versus a paleontological object. And, and it makes the point too that, human remains are not considered archaeological or not protected under the Heritage Conservation Act. That's a separate body of legislation, the Cemeteries Act.
Yeah, I think that's an important point too that you bring up, because this is the first time that we see sort of enshrined in legislation protection for built heritage and paleontological sort of objects as well. So, and then a couple of years later in 2012, we get sort of revised guidelines once again in the form of the guidelines and procedures for conducting professional archaeological assessments in New Brunswick. And those are the sort of the guidelines that we still operate under now. And those are updated guidelines they're fairly similar to what was issued in 2009. Those two documents, the one for CRM and the other for sort of academic archaeology, were later sort of, I think, merged into this one document to try to provide a more comprehensive and singular place to find information. But these 2012 guidelines also made specific reference to the Heritage Conservation Act and those kinds of things, that new legislation. So it was sort of updating a lot of that and making sure that those two documents sort of worked together as they were meant to, I guess.
Great. And so, Trevor, I mean, as what we're going to do now is we've got this sort of witness protection program kind of thing where we're going to actually blur your image and your voice, and I'm going to ask you to rank from worst to best every province's heritage legislation.
Oh,
no, sorry. I'm seeing a note here where that's been flagged as lawsuit, so we're not going to touch that. But maybe you could outline on that note what's the current legislative position here in New Brunswick archaeology. So, sort of, what are the rules, and how do we compare to other provinces or even countries? So, I mean, one of the distinctions, I guess, that we should maybe lay out right at the beginning here is that New Brunswick, I think, is somewhat unique in that it doesn't have federal heritage legislation, right?
Canada is unique in that.
Canada, sorry.
And so this will, in the States, you have a bit more of a top-down system where you have that the federal body of legislation, the National Historic Preservation Act, that kind of shaped what is known in this as the Section 106 process. Basically, any kind of federal money or federal investment or federal lands means that the NHPA kind of has this process that you have to follow. And as a result of that legislation, which came in 1966, throughout the United States, most states adopted essentially a mirrored process at the state level for conducting state-level assessments that mirrors the process in the Section 106. In Canada, you never had overarching federal legislation, and so what you have is each province and territory develop their own archaeological bodies of legislation, first of all, and then regulatory environments, right? And so you have in Canada everything from a situation where, for example, Newfoundland and Labrador and Prince Edward Island, where you don't actually have prescriptive guidelines for doing archaeological impact assessment work, so cultural resource management work, basically. You have a permitting process and everything like that, but you don't have these prescriptive documents like the guidelines in New Brunswick, all the way to places like New Brunswick or BC, where you have highly prescriptive guidelines that essentially dictate, here's the size of the test pits you have to dig, here's the interval that you have to dig these test pits in, here's the kinds of environments you need to do this in. And so, the differences are, for example, in New Brunswick, you dig a 50 centimeter by 50 centimeter square test pit. In Ontario, you dig a 30 centimeter round test pit. And in BC, you dig a 40 centimeter by 40 centimeter square test pit, right? And everywhere in between, depending upon where you are.
And I mean, the other thing too is like part of it is that this all relates to land and land use, right? And that sort of falls to oversight in many cases too. And like Ken said, there's no overarching archaeological legislation in Canada. We had Bill C-23, which, made it to second reading.
C-106 to make it a little easier.
Yeah, it made it to second reading, but then, our prime minister stepped down and dissolved parliament and all of those things, and I don't think we'll see it get revived. Maybe.
On a positive note, I've seen some emails in the last couple of weeks that actually there's a number of heritage organizations, funny enough, led by groups at the municipal level that are looking to retable something. So there might be more on that in the coming months.
That's good to hear. Yeah.
We should try to get one or two of those organizations on the podcast, just incidentally to.
Yeah. There's also a guy who's a heritage lawyer out of Ottawa, who I think would be a fantastic person to get on to talk about the heritage group, the National Trust review of C-23 and what their recommendations were. So.
That's great. I mean, we may also need him depending on where this conversation goes. I mean, we may need legal counsel.
I think the other thing, though, is that because even though we don't have overarching federal legislation, we are signatory to some international legislation that does have some weight behind it and some teeth, like the United Nations, UNESCO's conventions, international treaties sort of that are related to heritage, the 1970 Convention on, prohibiting and preventing, the illicit import and export of cultural property, and there's a few other conventions as well. But I mean, we also, tacitly endorsed the 2007 UN Declaration of Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It took some while for the Canadian government to sort of get on board with that. Federal legislation that does come into play every once in a while, like the Cultural Property Export and Import Act from 1985, I want to say, around there, and the Canadian Shipping Act from 2001. They all sort of deal with wrecked and abandoned or hazardous vehicles and things like that. But they sort of can work in protecting certain types of heritage resources.
So if they're wrecked and abandoned vehicles older than 100 years in this province, that may be relevant.
Yeah. One of the So one of the things I think the heritage, like there's a few things, like heritage conservation gets some things very right. Like it codifies in legislation the requirement to have a permit to conduct archaeological work. It criminalizes work that is done without a permit, but it also ties to that permit the legal requirement on the archaeologist to produce a report of those activities, which I think is actually really critical and actually is not in every legislative in every piece of legislation in Canada. There is always a requirement to produce a report, but if it's not embedded and tied to that, the actual legislation itself, it's less enforceable. But yeah, there are some quirks that come out of some of the definitions, and I think the funniest one in New Brunswick is as Gabe said, the older than 100 thing. But my favorite in New Brunswick is that any remains of a vehicle, automobile, or motorcycle known or suspected to be 75 years or older is technically an archaeological site. So for anybody who's driving a 1950s or earlier vehicle, you've got this highly mobile archaeological site, essentially.
They should require you to put the Borden number on the license plate.
Yeah. So
I think that should be.
That should be the license. I don't know if you guys remember, but I sent you that screenshot from the Norman Barca thesis on Portland Point there a few weeks ago, and he talks about before they did the excavation, they had to remove a bunch of derelict automobiles from on top of the site. And he discovered during that process that some of them were homes to what he called vagrants, but others were used as storehouses for the local bootlegger in St. John. So, you never know.
Yes, it's true. So for the 6 remaining listeners who stuck with us through the discussion of legislation, maybe we'll talk a little bit about the paper now. And the point of the paper really was that, as would be expected, legislation has an effect on archaeological practice, right? I mean, that's I don't think anyone would really dispute that. That's in some ways the goal. But what we're trying to do is track some of those changes, right? So when the legislation changed, what actually happens to research. And in doing that, we make the distinction between problem-oriented research, so sort of academic research, which you talked about, and cultural resource management, when you've talked about that a little bit. But how did we do this? Like, what did we use to measure the archaeology side of things and try to attach that to this timeline you just outlined?
Well, fortunately, as we mentioned earlier, archaeology is regulated, and one of the ways that it's regulated is through a permitting system. Every province and territory in Canada has a permitting or licensing system of some kind for professional archaeologists. In New Brunswick, you're issued permits on a project-by-project basis per archaeologist. So we used that data. That's I think was the best way to sort of analyze how much archaeology was going on, where it was occurring, what the types of archaeology were that were being done. So we were able to get copies of permit data from the province from 2006 until 2018 to kind of look at trends in, not only how much work was going on, but
actually it predates that. So remember, for the paper we had back to 1984. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, we have more detailed information, I guess is what I should say, from 2006 to 2018. But yes, from 1984 onwards, which is basically when the beginning of archaeology really starts, I think, outside of entities like the Provincial Archaeology Office and, the Canadian Museum or the Canadian Geological Survey or the Canadian Archaeological Survey, who had all kind of done dribs and drabs of work in the province up until that point in time. But this really sort of gave us an understanding of how that work occurred and when it occurred and how much of it.
Right, and we got those data through the RTIPA process, like the provincial.
Yeah, some of it Ken had originally for part of his master's thesis, years ago, and it was not quite as detailed. It was just numbers in a table, like here's how many permits this year.
I set off during my master's on what was essentially a separate master's project, and had probably one of the best professional rebukes, I would call it, from a colleague of ours, Kevin Leonard, who one time at a conference asked me what my thesis was about, and I went on about late maritime woodland lithic technology, and he was like, "So why are you looking at permit data?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm interested," and he's like, "Finish your thesis." So Kevin,
Trevor, did you hear that phrase? Finish your thesis? Yeah, okay. Just thought I'd to draw an emphasis to that phrase.
But yeah, so I in doing so, I was issued from the province kind of this a ledger that sort of had permit numbers, and I think just basically whether it was an impact assessment or if it was a research permit. Or if it was researched by their staff, but Trevor kind of took the ball and ran with it in terms of getting much more detailed data and breaking it down into what I think is probably the most effective piece of in this paper, and that's that Trevor looked at the policy eras that he talked about, where you have sort of pre-guidelines, so the time before 2004. And then the different phases between 2004 to 2009, 2009 to 2010, and then 2010 to 2012, and then post 2012, basically. And so you have introduction of new guidelines and then introduction of legislation in that time. And he's broken down the data in a way that, this, I think it's figure 4 from the paper that I include when I'm teaching CRM to my students, that I think is a really evocative way of showing the total change in the way that archaeology permitting and licensing looks to be tied to changes in policy, right? That it's not necessarily that there's more work happening. There's certainly booms and busts, but that there's a massive increase in the number of permits being issued after a certain point in time.
So we have that massive. Oh, go ahead, Trevor. Sorry.
And I was just going to say, and it's predominantly for commercial archaeology, for cultural resource management type of research as well, which we kind of jump into a discussion about that in the paper as well, where we talk about sort of the differences between problem-oriented archaeology, or what Binford called theory-oriented archaeology, and CRM. These ideas that problem-oriented archaeology is sort of built on a hypothesis framework, where we're trying to figure out, answer a question, or we're posing a question, or we're trying to conduct research to test that question, right? Whereas CRM is sort of there as a presence and absence framework. It's sort of a presence-absence process. Is there an archaeological site here that could be impacted in a negative way by whatever development we're doing the CRM work for, this new bridge or this new highway, those kinds of things. And often, it's the work in CRM is mitigation driven, where in problem-oriented archaeology, we're sort of out there doing research. We're driven by research. So these things, it's sort of the shift in the tone of the work that's going on sort of has a impact downstream when we look at how research is being published, or what's being published and what's not.
And so the good news then, of course, is that this massive increase in the number of permits, the huge amount of money spent on CRM, and all of these things have produced a huge number of papers that have really helped us to better understand the province of New Brunswick, that have really given the taxpayer what they've been paying for, and that have really, I think, made New Brunswick just one of the best archaeologically understood regions in North America. Would you care to elaborate on that, either of you?
You might detect a slightly cynical tone in Dr. Reineck's voice here, but yeah. So one of the challenges is that despite this massive influx in archaeological work going on in New Brunswick, it didn't coincide with a massive influx knowledge production or basically dissemination of that information that's coming out of the impact assessment industry, right? And so considerable amount of archaeology work being done in New Brunswick on an annual basis, but very little of that is pushed out technical reports. And the challenge with these technical reports that are a requirement, legislative requirement of all impact assessment work, is that while these are technically public documents, they are difficult to access. And it's also not just that once, say you had access to it, getting information about that, you would have to know basically where each of these projects are taking place. You'd have to know what the title of the project is. And so unless you kind of have a relationship with all of the CRM companies in the province and you're meeting with them regularly, you really don't have a sense of where people are working, how frequently they're working. And unfortunately, we don't get frequent updates from the province about or annual summaries of work. So Gabe and I have talked a number of times on the show about kind of the gold standard of this is the PAO annual report. The Alberta government issues the Blue Book, basically. It's a similar thing where many consultants actually publish short papers on results of their work. And so, if along with this increase in impact assessment archaeology, the other thing that Trevor has studied is looking at the sort of output of what's going on here. And with that, so for example, you have the last manuscripts in archaeology coming out in 2006, and that was a publication that was actually produced by the Archaeology and Heritage Branch, or what was then, I think it was still called Arch Services at the time. And so the province used to produce their own publication, of which we haven't seen come out in a while. And so while the province continues to participate, for example, in conferences, we don't see a whole lot of their work coming out in publication, and we certainly don't see a whole lot of the CRM industry taking impact assessment work and pushing it out into publications. Although, maybe a exception to the rule, for example, is the recent publication from Darcy Dignam about the Penfield site. So one of the things, and I'll get Trevor to kind of talk a little bit about this, is that not to spoil it too much, but we use an anecdote about research trajectories related to zooarch research as kind of a case study in the way that, so zooarchaeological research. So Trevor, want to tell us a little bit about what's happening with research in New Brunswick zooarchaeology and how it reflects what's happening more broadly, or what happened more broadly in New Brunswick archaeology within the time period we studied?
Well, one of the things that we picked up on pretty quickly when we started looking at these things is that the focus of most of these CRM projects, interior of the province in particular, and there's this shift from research archaeology to CRM archaeology also went hand in hand with this focus of salvage and archaeology that was really prominent in the 70s around the coast of, trying to save eroding archaeological sites on the coast. Of which, we're still trying to manage now. This shift from focusing on those to managing CRM projects and doing CRM research that were mostly projects in the interior, highways, those kinds of major developments, airports and things like that. So we see this less of a focus on coastal sites, coastal resources and things like that. But one of the other problems that you have is a sort of a methodological problem in CRM archaeology, in that a lot of the time you're not using screening and things like that in your shovel testing that's small enough to recover faunal materials and things like that. So there's becomes this gap in our knowledge about these things. And this was something that our friend and colleague Jesse Webb, I think, noted in his master's thesis back in, 2017, I want to say, was that, that there's this sort of disconnect between our understanding of people's presence on the landscape and their especially when it comes to subsistence practices.
The one analogy that I've thought about here, just to briefly interrupt, and the way I've thought about this, I think actually, and I think we talked about this, Trevor, when we were kind of formulating this paper, is if you sort of think about archaeology as kind of like a stereo system. You've got these various parts that make up the stereo system, right? You've got the source, and then you've got the preamplifier and the amplifier and the speakers and all the cables that hold it together. And what you really want to do is not dump a whole bunch of money into the stereo system and not have something nice come out the speakers. And what we're kind of trying to do is figure out, is try to locate some of the sources of where these good stereo components can be improved or better connected to think about what's coming out the speakers. And some of the stuff that we would like to be coming out the speakers would include things like zooarchaeological data, right? And so from a policy point of view, what we're trying to illustrate in this paper, I think, is some of the ways that we can consider how money might get translated into learning about the past. Would you say that's a kind of...
Yeah, and it's I think problematic when you think about the amount of time and money that's spent on these kinds of endeavors, and we're not always providing a product at the end that is first of all accessible, but also useful to other researchers or things like that, right?
And this is kind of the age-old question and tension with CRM, right? Is that like they're producing a ton of, it's like the industry is doing good archaeology and producing a ton of information, but it's how do you access that information? How do the people who want to use those data sets, how do they get access? How do they even know it's happening, basically, right? Like I used Alberta as an example of like that they do a good job of publishing some of this stuff, but it's also like there's the same issues out here. Like I have a graduate student right now who's looking at a particular site that she worked on just outside of Edmonton. On that particular site, they found a unique projectile point style that there's not many of these sites registered with the province, dating to, I don't know, sort of 6,000 years ago or something.
And I'm just going to chime in here and say, when n equals 1, every projectile point's unique.
Thank you, Gabe. But she has access to the online report library, right? But one of the things she found is that she's looking for other information about this particular time period and this particular type of projectile point. And even with a searchable online system where she can pull almost every report that's ever been done in CRM, she has trouble accessing information. And so worked in CRM, she's got access to the system, and she still has trouble locating and identifying these data sources. And so even when it's done well, it's difficult to find this stuff, and it's difficult for researchers to be able to engage with it, and for the public, it's even harder. And so when it's not done super well, and I think one of our points here is that in New Brunswick, we don't see that that kind of streamline from impact assessment to output that is a little bit more accessible. And, and this is and it's not like archaeology is cheap, right? Like, even within the provincial government, like I think we've got the 2023-24 annual budget figures for tourism, heritage, and culture suggest that the ARC branch has about a $16 million budget, right? And so, one of the things you would hope to see coming out of that, greater access to the information about archaeology. And, and I think that that's kind of the big thing, that like, there's no one set way of doing this, that there is enough work that's happening and we're not seeing the result of it, that I think something has to shift.
Yeah. So that's a really interesting point. And one of the things I just want to clarify to the listener, could you tell us how much is that in rupees?
I don't get what the joke is here.
And that doesn't count. That money doesn't count just the amount of money that like a company spends to get a CRM project done, right?
No, that's just
the operating budget for the government.
That's just the operating budget for the government. And so, like, we'll probably in a future episode have colleagues of mine, Lindsay Amundsen-Meyer and Matt Monroe, on. We've got a paper that's in review right now where we're looking at the CRM industry as a whole. And we're talking about, like, even in New Brunswick, the impact assessment industry is probably worth tens of millions of dollars beyond what the province's own office is. And so there's a ton of money in this industry. And I think that archaeology in general, we believe to be sort of a public good, right? It's something that's incredibly important, or that we all believe that heritage is important. It's a shared thing. And even in, like the heritage, there's legislation specifically saying that this is something that we want to protect and share. And so I think the onus is on archaeologists in the consulting industry, as researchers, and also at the provincial level, to think about that and think about ways that we can to better get that information out and distill it in a way that the public can engage with, but also that other researchers can engage with. Right. I think we're all working on a project right now where we're trying to unpack what's going on in the late Paleo-Indian period, and I'm guessing somewhere in the last 50 years of impact assessments that have been going on in New Brunswick, somebody's probably found a fragment of a lanceolate point that just hasn't been identified as that, or maybe it was and it's just buried in a report somewhere, right?
Yeah, I think that's totally possible. I mean, so the issue here too, I mean, I think to some degree is that this amount of money, it would be good if it produced a database that at least is kind of navigable, right? So that, for instance, even rights holders, Indigenous communities, at least sort of would have a list to know what to request, right? They could say, well, we're interested in this area, to what degree can we fairly quickly know what sort of stuff was going on? What do you guys think archaeologists could do to be more accountable to the public? We offer some suggestions in this paper, whether these would be kind of legislative solutions, or tell me what you guys think.
Well, I think we need to, obviously, I think the stark thing is we're not publishing enough. We're not sharing this information enough to, I think, or I should say, we're not sharing it as much as we should be, this information as much as we should be. And I think that this is sort of, I think it's equal parts fault and also, lack of support or, requirement, whatever we want to frame it from a policy standpoint. There are other jurisdictions that, have policies set out that, encourage or enforce you to share the results of your research and things like that. And I think we need to look at policy implementations that can sort of improve that or encourage those kinds of things. But I think we also need to, we need to get people on board with sharing their information more widely, and presenting these kinds of results. And often, and this isn't to say that CRM archaeologists in Canada or the United States aren't doing this kind of stuff. As Ken said earlier, there are folks that are doing this, but it just, to the degree, when we compare it to the amount of work that's going on, the degree with which this information is getting out there seems to be fairly minuscule. And it seems that policy has sort of directly stagnated this kind of, problem-oriented archaeological research. And that's, particularly problematic when we consider, rising eustatic sea levels, storm frequency and amplitude that are, eroding the coastlines of New Brunswick and other places in Canada at an alarming rate. And there's very little work going on in these areas. You guys, Gabe in particular, you do a lot of coastal work in Maine and things like that. And I mean, there are, archaeological sites that were on the coast 30 or 40 years ago that are no more now. There are no signs of anywhere in the areas where they were previously mapped and things like that. So I think in the very least, we need to be encouraging people to find ways to share their information, to share that research and those results more frequently. Other venues, perhaps,
Turnbull's prescience again, right? He's got this quote we use in the conclusion of our paper: "The concern for the future of our archaeology must be translated into action," which I guess is sort of what you're getting at.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Like
I think like a really
kind of sit on our laurels and just wait for somebody else to kind of do this. We all, I think, have to kind of.
One thing I've kind of thought about that, like, in my mind, this seems fairly straightforward and a really simple thing to do is, there's permits issued and every single permit has a report tied to it. And almost every report nowadays has a 1-page executive summary of like everything that happened for that report. Just pull every one of those executive summaries and put them in a PDF once a year, because there's about 100 permits on average issued, I think, every year in New Brunswick. Like, you'd have a 100-page PDF that you can flip through and you can see whether or not they found anything. Like, I mean, some of these reports are like 10 pages long, and it's like, we went out, we dug 50 test pits, we didn't find anything, right? And like, that's great. That's what a lot of CRM is. It's culvert inspections and stuff like that. And it ends up being, there's nothing that comes out of it. But maybe you find a small lithic scatter, or maybe you find a couple of artifacts on the beach here, that kind of thing, right? And so if you had this, what I suspect would be a relatively easy to produce thing, and at the back, the province can include, a 2 or 3 page summary of the kinds of work that they did, right? And at the very least, you would have the title of the project and the report that then you can reach out to the province. And to their credit, have been very good about issuing reports when you request them. Send the title of the report and say, could I get a copy of this, right? And all those documents are publicly available. And as far as I understand, we're not in a situation where in other provinces where like clients, for example, have asked for like non-disclosure agreements and things like that and put embargoes on data. And so once that report is issued to the province as part of your regulatory requirement, that is a document that everybody should be able to get access to. And if you got one document that kind of pens all of these different executive summaries together, at least there you've got a starting. It doesn't have to be a journal quality publication on everything. It's just knowing what's going on would be great.
And it might be worth noting that that's also an ethical requirement of archaeology, is expedient reporting, publication, and sharing with the public.
That's exactly where I was going next. That's the one thing that we haven't really talked about yet, is that this is an ethical responsibility of just about any archaeological professional association or any kind of association, the SAA, the CAA, the RPA. Like, our job is to disseminate this information for the benefit of the public, for Indigenous descent communities and all of those folks that that this information is relevant to,
and to see our own names in print. Let's not forget the ego factor here.
And what? Sorry,
to see our own names in print.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And every year you get, the proceedings of the 2025 New Brunswick Archaeological Field Season, and you can cite it every year. You've got a new publication. You got your executive summary that you wrote.
Absolutely, and the good news is that Ken's dean will have no idea that is just a collection of executive summaries. You'll be promoted so fast, Ken. You might be dean.
There you go. I don't know. Yeah. Does anybody really want to be a dean?
The scary thing about university administrators, to paraphrase P.J. O'Rourke, is they're really not in it for the money. But on that kind of note where we are there, I think maybe where we could leave this conversation, being sort of mindful of their time, and also that we're dragging the listener through somewhat arcane legislative discussion, is if and you sort of hinted at this, Ken, you've kind of said what you think a starting place would be. Are there any kind of thoughts that you'd like to leave the listener with, Trevor, or next steps in this research?
Yeah, I think, at a bare minimum, publishing every year, a list of the number of permits issued, the types of work being done in the province, and these kinds of things, is the bare minimum that we can be doing here in New Brunswick and elsewhere. As you alluded to earlier, like the gold standard, in many of our opinions, the three of us included, is the Newfoundland and Labrador's Provincial Office of Archaeology, or Provincial Archaeology Office's annual report, which is, provides that big summary of everything that's gone on in the province. And I think we should strive for something like that. I don't think that's out of the question to do, and especially if you're, not printing this document, if you're, putting it together as sort of a professional looking PDF, electronic document, those kinds of things, you can sort of cut out a lot of costs associated with producing this information. Or, as Ken said, even if we can just start with something as simple as, here's the executive summaries from all of these reports, so that I, as a researcher who's interested in researching, hunter-gatherers, or a particular region in New Brunswick. I want to research the northwest, or the north coast of New Brunswick, and things like that. Then it gives me a place to start looking and to doing this kind of research, because in the absence of any kind of database or online portals or online web maps or anything like that people can get access to in this province for that kind of information, there's not really any other way to go about it. So I could go on and on, but
yeah. So publish here is the key. Publish, right? And we would welcome, I guess, legislative things that encourage that. And maybe one of the things that this paper has highlighted is just maybe some of the ways that legislation has been successful in getting more money for archaeology, but that we still need to be better at getting that money into an accessible kind of archaeological report for researchers, stakeholders, and the general public.
Yeah,
and
so
one thing, very much, gentlemen.
Well, one thing before we go that I would add to what Trevor said is I think the next steps are maybe it'd be really, like, I'm personally, and I think we all are curious, is whether this trend continues after 2018, right? And so, we see when the listener picks up this paper, they'll see that there is a shift in permitting that kind of changes around. It looks like there's kind of a reversal of the trend starting in 2018. And so did that carry through over the last 7 years, I guess, right? And so, I think one of the things that would be really great is to kind of see what the trends look like almost 7 years later. And so who knows, maybe we'll be doing, this will be the trilogy will be complete once we, do of Backdirt Revisited, of Backdirt and Bureaucracy Revisited.
Yes.
So,
well, Tokyo Drift, I think it's called.
Yes. Yeah. Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
All right, gentlemen. Well, it was a pleasure as always, and hopefully by the time this drops, that paper will be out, and we will be able to throw a link to it in the show notes. Listener, if it's not in the show notes, stay tuned, and we will drop it in a future show notes. But it should be up any day now.
Yeah, and that is Backdirt and Bureaucracy Revisited: An Analysis of Research Trends in New Brunswick's Archaeology Practice Using Historic Data. Trevor, the lead author, M. Gabriel Reineck, and myself. And that's in Canadian Journal of Archaeology's 47th volume, page numbers TBD, and it'll be labeled 2023. So, Trevor, thanks again for coming on. It's always great to see you and chat with you. And maybe on the next one we'll be talking about Trevor Dow, MA, and all the fun stuff we're doing in New Brunswick.
Late Paleo period.
Exactly.
That's great. Thanks very much, Trevor. And this was an all hit piece episode. So we appreciate having you on here for that extended hit piece.
Yeah. So the listener will notice that we don't have hits piece music this week. And the hit piece is as Gabe said, the paper that we're just talking about. And so we'll be back in a fortnight, Gabe. And I believe our next episode might have a dash of field work from down East Maine. Is that correct?
From Southern Maine, I think we may be doing an on location from Southern Maine.
From Southern Maine, yes. So
yep.
from the banks of the Saco into your hearts.
Yeah, it's gonna hit your ears like number 2 hit Saco.
There you go, listener. All right, we'll talk to you in a fortnight.
See you later, listener.